growth, good or otherwise, is always going to be hampered if we don't have resilience to climate shocks, to floods, to heat, to societal upheaval, to cyber shocks and financial shocks. So, leading the conversation about how we can build resilience into our society and our economy, please welcome to the stage our next panel, moderated by Sarah Stefanini, the EMEA Policy Editor for Carbon Pulse. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much. I'll just wait for all our speakers to join. Yeah, so we're going to look now at building resilience for society and economy, and basically the role of insurance here in sort of helping to not just build back what is lost in a flood or a fire or any other kind of catastrophe, but also building back in a resilient way so that hopefully when the next flood comes, a house or a business won't go through the same kind of destruction. And so we are going to kick it off with Jonathan Day, Deputy Director of Risk Assessment and Research, Flood and Coastal Risk Management at the UK's Environment Agency. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. Morning, everybody. My name's Jonathan Day. I work for the Environment Agency and I'm responsible for our flood risk assessment work. So that's our national scale flood mapping and all the models and data that underpins that. And that's really important to us as part of our flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. And our strategic vision is around building a climate resilient nation. The language is really important. We used to talk about protection and defence, but obviously we can't eliminate flood risk, so we have a more balanced strategy now where protection sits alongside preparedness and response and recovery. And our work with insurance is absolutely fundamental to that, particularly on the recovery side of things, because obviously a flood-affected community that doesn't have insurance takes much longer to get back on its feet. So that's really important. And looking back, the UK has actually been unusual in that insurance has historically been available as standard on home insurance policies. That doesn't happen necessarily elsewhere in the world, and even before the establishment of Flood Re, that was kind of the case through a gentleman's agreement between government and the insurance industry, whereby it would be a case of if government invests in flooding, then the insurers will keep insurance available. But an observation from my point of view is that when we develop our flood risk assessment and when we find out more about present day risk and especially more about how that risk might evolve in future, this kind of relationship gets stretched and challenged. And that's really relevant to us at the moment because a few months ago at the Environment Agency we published a landmark update of our national flood risk assessment, and we're including a much better representation of flooding, much more detail, and for the first time we're including mapping showing climate change impacts. And I think this brings sort of opportunities and risks, opportunities at all levels, whether it's to think about sort of proactive management of flood risk. So that could be, householder thinking about property level flood resilience measures based on perhaps relatively shallow flooding in their area, right up to financial institutions thinking about exposure to climate risk. So lots of opportunities, but actually threats as well, because it worries me that I hear increasingly people talking about being refused insurance, and particularly, for example, in basement flats who are leaseholders and not covered by the Flood Re scheme. And I do worry about how that's going to play out in future, and the transition to a risk-reflective pricing system, which is meant to take place in about 15 years' time. I could imagine that there are some quite big risks in that. So I think it'd be great to have a conversation today about how we continue to work together to think about those long-term risks.
And with that, Alex Bedford is Customer and Partnership Manager at Zurich Municipal. She's replacing Amy Brettel, who is very, very sorry that she couldn't make it. But from the insurance industry point of view, how are you responding to these changing risks, and what does the industry need to do differently?
Thank you. We're really happy to be here today. And actually, the first thing we need to do differently is have way more of these kind of conversations. That's a key point here. We find that we're often brought in at the end of processes when resilience measures have been decided, but the insurance angle hasn't always necessarily been taken into account. It's been assumed. Which it can't be anymore. So conversations early and often is a key ask from us as an insurer in this space. The other point for us is, so I actually work, and Amy is the managing director of a business unit within the Zurich Group, Zurich Municipal. We are a public and voluntary sector facing business unit. So we insure local government, education institutions, housing associations, charities and voluntary organisations. So the social resilience side of what we're talking about is really important. Property resilience, yes, but actually what those properties enable people to then access and do, what it enables our customers to serve those communities with. So that social and human impact of lessening resilience is something that we're really keen to always bring to the table, even when we're talking to our property underwriters. Actually, there are people at the end of these conversations that we really can't lose sight of. So we're very happy to be here, and more of these conversations, please.
And John Willis, Senior Director of Aligning Finance and Value at WBCSD. So looking at it from the wider point of view, how do you see the insurance industry changing or not changing in response to climate change, and what should be happening?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me here. In fact, I'm coming back home because I've only been with an organisation with one of the longest acronyms I've ever come across, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But previously, I was with the Tracker Group, that's Carbon Tracker and Planet Tracker, and we had the pleasure of working upstairs. And it was a great networking place, I have to say, because I would always say I've got a bar above me and a bar below me. And that was very, very good at attracting people. I used to pretend they wanted to come and speak to me. On insurance, interesting, as I say, I confess I've only been with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for a week, but I got absolutely hit straight away because they're setting up a physical risk panel, and the interest from corporates is through the roof. And actually, it should be. There's been a number of comments that have completely resonated with me in previous panels, and one that I just thought is so right is insurance must not be treated as over there or alone. And I sort of went through this with the NGO community, and people would say, well, you're for a finance background, because I used to work for the investment banks, and they would sort of politely walk away. And I always felt sort of insurance and pensions, oh, you do pensions, or you do insurance, you know, sort of walk away. But it's everywhere. It really is everywhere, and you can watch this playing out. So just a couple of things to look at when I said it. If you are a corporate lender, you have to be thinking about insurance. Are you lending on assets which are uninsurable? If you are a director of a corporate now, and you have either built assets or are building assets which are becoming uninsurable, what are you going to do as a director? You really have to start thinking very, very hard. What if you're an equity holder? What if you are a shareholder in these companies? And I won't go into it now, but you've got to look into the detail of how corporates are going to deal with that. So some are going into pools. So as an investor, are you going to be invested in a company but is actually insuring something somewhere else? These affect the financial markets, they affect our business environments, so we're very much integrated into the insurance ecosystem.
Thank you. And Alex Woodman, Chief Fire Officer at the Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service and Chair of the Local Resilience Forum and member of the National Fire Chiefs Council. So we've heard a bit about floods from Jonathan. How do you see your work changing? What is changing in terms of fires and risks of fires, and what is the role of insurance in that?
Good morning. So I think we tend to cover a lot of the same ground but at different phases, and I don't think we align enough when we do that. So the success, if I look at fire and rescue, probably over the last 15 years, has been around its ability to do prevention, but I don't think we're aligned enough across the UK and what that means. I don't think we harness enough of the skill and knowledge across the private sector, and I think we're too distant in the public sector. We're focused on response, and we put a lot of emphasis on that, and our public services are good at responding. The area that I think we need to enhance, particularly with the skills, the knowledge, the analytical insights, the data, the modelling, the wider views that insurance sector can take, is something that I don't feel we harness enough across the UK from a response side. I think there's also a bit of a danger of the glory as well of response, and we don't think about the hard yards in being prepared for stopping, modelling, preventative work. And I think when I speak more stepping outside of fire, but the work of local resilience forums, their core being should be around being into prevention. But I think sometimes we look too local and we don't think big enough about the collective strength that we can do around our wider prevention strategies. So I think the angle for me is very much around making sure that we have a genuine round table of system players in prevention, but that also flicks to a very strong response that we need in response, because many players in this room will be part of that response when it's gone wrong. We can't lose sight of it going wrong, but we need to do more when it comes to our prevention arms and coming together as a system.
Thank you. And finally, Emma Howard-Boyd, currently Chair of Client Earth, but formerly Chair of the UK Environment Agency and also formerly a board member of the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. What is the government's role in this? And your thoughts on how insurance is changing and what insurance needs to do?
So I want to build off what Alex has just said in terms of the role of first responders to some of the events that we are talking about and building in a longer term response. I also chaired the London Climate Resilience Review for Sadiq Khan, and right from the get-go, it was called the London Climate Resilience Review, but it was commissioned by the adaptation team, and therein lies some of the issues that we start at, whether it's at a local authority level, whether at a departmental level, whether at a corporate level, whether at a national government level, that we are putting this subject, this incredibly important subject, into too many different boxes. And it's very, very clear from the work that I've done, both as chair of the Environment Agency, but also chairing the London Climate Resilience Review, that we need to go from first response. And again, some insurance companies have got some amazing programs of supported those flooded communities, those communities suffering from other climate impacts. But more needs to happen. And if you go back to what inspired the London Climate Resilience Review, which was the extreme heat of July 2022, you started off with prolonged dry weather, then a heat wave, which meant that there was stress on water use. Water usage went up 50%. When it came to the ring of fire that surrounded London, there's one part of London where when the fire brigade went to put out the fire, and it was the busiest day for the fire brigade since the Second World War, the water pressure was down. Think Los Angeles earlier this year. And then what often happens with a heat event is that it breaks with extreme rainfall. And one of the things that the National Assessment does very well, the Environment Agency data that was also, I think Barnaby drew attention to it in his opening remarks, is surface water flooding is dealt with by local authorities, whereas river-related flooding and coastal flooding is led in England by the Environment Agency. So there is a real importance of putting attention on bringing together the different players on this subject to discuss real long-term solutions. But I want to put some urgency and attention into right now, because right now our government in the UK is looking at its spending review. And for those of you who have looked at detail in the autumn budget and look at the different departmental settlements, one of the things that it says very clearly right now is that the flood budget will be under review because of the financial pressures that exist. We're at a really crucial moment. Claudine talked earlier about heat. That this is just one bit of the climate resilience budget for government. We need to make sure that collectively we're not going backwards on the flood budget, so that we can do the work that is needed there, but also the work that we need to see happen on other climate resilience areas. I think the other final point that I want to make as former chair of the Environment Agency is when government funds flood defences and takes an area of the country from being at extreme risk to being protected, there needs to be some way of sharing the growth that comes after those flood defences are put in place. And this is where the business community and the insurance industry can help, because it's all the same money, but that's coming from taxpayers. But ultimately, and various speakers have talked about the need for the insurance industry to make profits, but some of those profits also need to be shared back with communities and governments to make sure that we are not just seeing government fund the defences, but there's some money coming back to government to allow more to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. So Emma started to do this, but I was going to ask Alex and Jonathan to sort of paint a picture about what is the change that you're seeing in terms of natural disasters. I mean, everyone can picture the California fires. Everyone can picture some of the recent floods in the UK. Alex, in your work, you've been in this line of work for a long time. Are you really feeling and seeing change in terms of fires and risks? And same, Jonathan.
So I think if you look on your TVs, it's pretty evident the impact, specifically around climate change and what it's having. Our response to flooding, our response to fires, particularly, who would have thought we'd have wildfires in London? It's not the type of headline you think we'd ever have. To put it into a bit more context, those extreme heat and the wildfires that we saw during that summer, I ran out of firefighters in Hertfordshire. We were at the point sitting in our control room where every one of our fire engines was committed, every firefighter was committed, and we had every one of our on-call service at 100% availability and committed. Decisions by my commanders were being made to release asset to come into London to help because of life risk calls. So it couldn't be more real about what is happening. And I think if we move on to the flood side of things, I think also the understanding of roles and responsibilities when it comes to flood, because the role of the fire service in flood is somewhat limited. Most people think it is the role of the fire service to go out and deal with flooding. I won't get into major debate today, but there is a technical point that we don't have a remit with flood. We will deploy asset and if there's life risk, but just understanding that surface water flooding, which becomes a major impact. We're seeing more rivers in Hertfordshire flooding that haven't flooded for 50 to 60 years. We've got a couple of live flood risks at the minute that we're looking at. We're having conversations that these areas haven't flooded for over, I think one of our areas is 65 years that no one's had it. So people have lived in their homes, their properties, their whole lives, but they had no idea that this was a flood risk. These things are happening live as we speak. So it is a real changing dynamic for us in what is happening to our type of response.
Yeah, simple answer. Are we seeing changes? Yes, I think Alex has painted a really a good picture of that already. Over the last few months, over the sort of winter storm season, we think around 5,000 properties probably flooded across England. That would, in maybe a decade ago, that might have sounded like quite a bad winter. I think that's just pretty normal now, and every season, if you want to call that a flood season, although flooding can happen obviously year round, we are seeing sort of record water levels somewhere in the country. So yes, it's changing. I think the sobering thought is in the future, I think we'd be doing very well indeed if we manage to keep the sort of national level of flood risk at present day levels. You know, it's likely to get worse. I think we need to also factor that into our conversation.
Can I jump in on powers? Because I think it's not just something about powers to relevant agencies, it's also to whether this is dealt with at national government or local government. And the work that I did with the Mayor of London, but also with other mayors, not just in this country, but around the world, getting the right powers and responsibilities, making responsibility for climate change, adaptation, resilience, statutory, means that you have to start allocating money towards this, but also allows different levels of government to raise money and work with the private sector to bring in those different ways of financing the work that we so desperately need. Thank you.
Thank you. And in terms of working with the private sector, Alex and maybe John also, how do you reconcile the fact that insurance is also a business and insurance companies do want to make money, but in a way, there's a public good that they need to provide too and a societal benefit? How are they dealing with that?
So I'll go first as the insurer on panel. So absolutely, I think that's the whole point of this, and particularly in our little part of the business, that balancing is absolutely critical. So we are working with publicly funded organisations, or whether that's through government funding or through donors, or investors in the charity and voluntary space. So we need to do good while also doing well, to steal a phrase, because we have to do well, because we need to be there to pay claims. But to keep that manageable, we need to be working with our customers, with governments, with partners in the room. We've talked about pre-event, so extending the life cycle essentially of how we're thinking about resilience. So a long time pre-event, so you're planning, you're making those connections before you need them. But also recovery, you've talked about response. Recovery takes a lot longer than response. So anything we can do to think about beforehand, mitigations we can put in place that can speed up the way in which we can recover, will only help those people who are experiencing the floods or the fires or the heat that the climate changes are bringing to us. So in terms of how we can support that, I think the whole sector has been very much looking at our end-to-end proposition around that. So we are not just there at the point of claim. The conversation needs to be starting a long time before that, and it needs to be extending a long time past that, so that when we are responding, Build Back Better has been mentioned, we now look at the sort of human impact of something like a flood. So it's not just about getting you back into your home, if you're a housing association tenant, in our world, or back into your school to deliver education. It's actually how do we use our expertise and our supply chain to do that in a more resilient way. So if you've had a water ingress, cages on gutters, real simple stuff that doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but we can bring in that expertise so that you can continue in a much more resilient way, because the same thing will probably happen otherwise. So it is a shift in how we are looking at our proposition and our end-to-end support.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Let me stir things up. I do think that business has to be very much part of this discussion, and I'm going to just give a couple of examples. So one is, I'm now going to jump on the side of the insurance companies. I think it's very easy for us to say to the insurance companies, they don't always, you make a lot of money, share it around with everyone else, but they've still got businesses to run. And one of the issues that they have, you can actually see within their business. So they've got an underwriting business providing all of this protection, and they can also have an investment business. And a question came up earlier about well, in your investment side, and it was well dealt with by a very skilled diplomat, on your investment side, is it all sustainable? On the investment side, their job is to make returns. And those returns are of value to all the insurance market. So ideally, you might want all of those returns to be sustainable. I'll guarantee they won't be, because that's not what those portfolio managers are paid to do. They're paid to get the highest returns, to get the reserves for the insurance companies so they can meet all the regulatory requirements. I'd also say from a business point of view that actually businesses are going beyond just worrying about property. There are indirect risks with wildfires and flooding, etc. And that can be, let me give an example. Brazil, a very big bioeconomy, one of the biggest exporters of food commodities in the world. And there's very interesting academic research about how some labor productivity is falling because of heat stress. People are finding it difficult to work in those environments, okay? So think about other indirect impacts. One of the issues now being discussed in California, and we've got a relationship with Stanford University there, one of the issues they're worrying about is housing for employees. So if they're in the cheaper housing, which you can't insure, are you going to be in that housing and go and get a job? So suddenly they're worrying about labour resources. And then finally, a conflict that I had to deal with in my previous job at Planet Tracker was we were examining oceans, and there's a thing called IUU, which is basically illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And we were talking to insurance companies who actually were insuring these vessels, and you go, well, why? You shouldn't be touching it. And they're going, yeah, but these are the most vulnerable people in society. So are you telling us not to insure them? So all I'm trying to indicate is these conflicts that exist, but business must be part of the solution.
Alex, you wanted to come in?
I was going to make a bit more of a blunt point as well. I think sometimes we need to get over ourselves and look at our governance arrangements, because I think we're very good at telling each other why we can't do something. But what I don't think we do is enough of coming together and looking at the system. And that's why I'm trying to step away. As an LRF chair, I'm a neutral individual. I don't represent individual agencies. I represent the system of Hertfordshire. And in turn, I'm trying to bring together some of our LRF chair, or all of the LRF chairs across the UK at the moment, to have a conversation that looks at how does the system work. And I think that's the challenge back to everybody in the room of how do we come together. We come together and talk about a problem and what we're going to do about that problem. But actually, most of what we do as a collective system can be mapped across any of our problems. And I don't think we do enough about challenging our governance arrangements and harnessing or leveraging the power of the system. And I think that's something that's just an important focus. There isn't, government has a strong convening power. LRFs have a strong convening power. This forum here today has a strong convening power. But it's what we do about making sure that we operate as a system and don't point at each other around responsibilities. And I don't think we're good enough at doing that. We're very polite about it, but we need to be more blunt.
Thank you.
And I think that is a fantastic point, and it links to what regulators need to do as well. So I've often said environmental regulators need to work in lockstep with economic regulators, financial regulators. We need to go to those places where we need to hold the mirror up and ask us, are we really doing enough with what we're doing on the insurance side versus the investment side, whether it's in insurance companies or pension funds, and we have to start acting with that. Can we go to those difficult places and see if we can unlock that real urgent action that we need? And I think some of those solutions often lie in places absolutely at the forefront of the extreme events that are being experienced right now. So whether it's pulling climate change into the finance departments, as we've seen in certain governments in and around the world. When we look at some of the solutions and job creations that I've been able to see in my role as co-chair of Climate Resilience for All, where you're bringing together different partners, including philanthropy, including the insurance industry, to create new kinds of micro-insurance products which pay out when so people don't need to work in extreme heat. These are the things that we need to see happen quickly and scale up so that we can really deal with some of the big issues that are happening right now and not in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We are quickly running out of time, and I will open it up to questions. But I also wanted to ask, possibly for Alex in particular, how is risk modeling changing, and what is the insurance industry? We're seeing increasing record-setting days of rain, heat. Last weekend was record heat in March, at least in Brussels, where I was. How are you taking that into account as an insurer, and how is it changing what you're doing?
Okay. So one of the superpowers, I think the phrase was used in one of the earlier sessions, that we do have is climate modelling expertise. We have a lot of data. We put it together in ways that make sense for us in terms of our insurance book and our investment business. So we have our climate modelling focused in those two areas. And I think, again, talking about in-year analysis, we absolutely are looking both in-year and long-term. Again, we are widening the scope of where we're looking. What is interesting is a lot of challenge I get when I'm out talking to our customers is, can we have your data, please? But as I said, the data is modelled in a way that reflects the questions that we are asking ourselves as an insurer and an investor. You may be asking different questions, so the data is a different set, or you need to look at it in a different way. Data needs to be understood in context. It's a really important point here. And we are looking at developing the sort of climate modelling capabilities that we have into more customer-facing solutions. So there's a climate spotlight tool that has been launched by Zurich's Resilience Solutions arm. We are piloting it with Surrey County Council in the public sector amongst the Zurich municipal customer base, just to see if it works. Data is not always a panacea, and I think sometimes we're at risk of thinking it is. We're chasing it all the time. So we are constantly evolving our own climate modelling capability, because we are learning more and more. The science is becoming more and more sophisticated. The reforecasting is constant. But also looking at how we make that more publicly available, so we get more of a shared understanding of risk profiles, to make conversations, convening conversations easier.
Thank you. So Jonathan would like to come in, but I will just ask, if you'd like to ask a question, maybe raise your hand and get ready, so that then we can move straight on to that.
Yeah, it was just very quickly on data to say it's important to us. Our flood risk data is all open. We have a digital service called Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk, and that's just been upgraded to carry our new information. So it's really important to us that we raise awareness of risk, and people learn more about their risk. And it is one of our challenges as well, because actually the reality is that I think in our surveys, maybe only 30-40% of people who are in flood risk areas are actually aware of their own risk, and that's something, perhaps one of those gaps that perhaps the insurance industry can help us with. Another one might be, can insurance incentivise risk management behaviours as well? So,
John?
Yeah, just very quickly, I just want to say, I mean, the insurance companies, a number of them, seem to be very, very accurate in their models, so much so that you had a Californian regulator telling them not to use them, so they withdrew from the market. So that's now been stopped because that was absurd. There was a question earlier at an earlier panel more about tipping points. That is much more difficult. There's a lot of work being done at particularly at Exeter University on that, and that is tricky about the effects of that. But near term, it seems they're getting increasingly accurate.
Thank you. Any questions? And please introduce yourselves.
Hello.
Hi,
Yep.
Chris Lynch from the National Trust.
One thing that hasn't been talked about a huge amount today so far is climate adaptation. Emma kind of touched on it a little bit. But if resilience is the outcome that we're aiming for, then adaptation is the process to get there. So I'm curious, particularly from John and from Alex, what more business and the insurance sector can do to galvanise action on that. And specifically, Alex, for example, you work with public sector organisations. They are obligated to report under the National Adaptation Programme. Would expanding that to private businesses, for example, be a route to do that? Thank you.
Let me just give you an example of adaptation, and I think you're going to see more and more of this. If Miami, everyone knows, is at serious risk of flooding, and what's been happening along that coast is actually an alliance between some of the insurance company and real estate. And what the economic judgment they've made is that on some of the property, they're actually not building. And they've created, I don't want to go over the top, like a mini floodplain. So if the water rises, it's not actually reaching the property. So they go for parkland. Because of that, the insurance companies are willing to lower the premium. That's very attractive for the real estate developer, who will sort of sell that messaging. And that's how I think, so I'm just giving you one example of how adaptation can actually work really effectively and is in practice.
So in terms of adaptation, so I was involved in a rapid adaptation pathways assessment plan workshop recently, RAPA for short, an area that is subject to tidal fluvial flooding, and for the first time, everyone involved, from individual residents to British Nuclear, who had to the railways, were in the room, and so were we. The value that, so as we were going through different adaptation options, then sort of basically coming to us for a bit of a view of, if we do this, will you? Rather than, we are going to do this, this is the best option, and then bringing the insurer in at the end and then asking lots of difficult questions that put everyone a bit on the back foot. So adaptation is the way. Understanding what adaptations is going to help an insurable risk is key there if we want to get bang for our buck around the investment that we're making in them. The other point around that is also, we have put adaptations in place that then aren't maintained. So thinking about the longer term plan, so that we're not constantly having to reinvest and find new money for extra or future adaptations or repair of adaptations. So yes, adaptation, building the adaptation journey so that we reach a point where we are more resilient needs to be the journey we're all on, but bringing insurers in, if we want insurance to be part of that resilient solution, as I say, at design stage, it would be great.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I see a microphone up there. Go ahead.
Julian Richardson, Chief Underwriting Officer at Munich Re, Green Solutions. I'd like to pick up on Alex's point around the profitability of insurance and the role of the private sector and private insurance here. You know, John, you made a really good point about the insurers pulling out of the California market because they were not allowed to make profit. And that is a very real thing. At the end of the day, it's a competition for capital. I'm allowed to underwrite nearly $500 billion of renewable energy risk because I can attract the capital to do it. The insurance industry actually isn't highly profitable. We don't get many new insurers started up because the return on capital is really low. Sometimes we do make some good returns, but the long-term return on capital is very poor. But the important question is not, can we make a profit or not? It's how that capital is used. Right? So, Emma, you made a really important question about working with the insurance. How would you like to see the insurance industry deploy its capital? And let's move away from the question of should we be allowed to make a profit or not? Because if we can't, nothing will happen.
Emma, John?
I mean, this is a whole session on its own, and I can't see you. I don't know. Right, great. It's a whole massive discussion. How do we how do we get that combination of investment in the right way? And I think one massive project that needs this kind of thorough investigation, challenge as to how to invest in the right way is actually here in London, and the Thames Estuary 2100 programme, which is a world-renowned adaptive pathway setting out how London needs to reinvest in a barrier, the hundreds of kilometres of defence systems that protect London, all of its assets, all of its people, and bringing that that discussion around a real-life example that needs to be funded and delivered by very set periods of time, which are actually coming further or nearer into time, as well as the science is telling us, is one way that we can make a real difference and bring together the right combination of investors, agencies, government, businesses to get this right. You've also got 30-odd local authorities across London, and unless every single one of those local authorities works together consistently on this one climate hazard, we won't be protecting London in the way that it needs to be by, I think the first set of risks start kicking in 2035 beyond the barrier, and slightly later this side of the barrier. And I'm not talking about the barrier itself, that needs to be built by 2070 is the current best assessment. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to come up with a simple answer to this, but there are some very, very big projects that if London is not climate resilient in this country, it could, as the only part of the country that has net positive contribution to the economy, then it could, what it could mean for the UK as a whole doesn't bear thinking about. So we need to get these conversations happening sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just make 2 points, if I may. One is, it is important that insurance companies, unless they're mutual, that they make a profit. Because if you don't, your cost of capital goes up, the shareholders pull out, and then suddenly you can't finance it. That is the reality. What worries me is that the insurance sector is being teed up in the sort of political sites, if you like, because it's a great headline, isn't it? An insurance company will not insure me. Well, yeah, that's because you're in the middle of a floodplain, and I'm not allowed to charge you the premium I want, and it's linked into the inflation argument. But, you know, insurance companies are, I'm sure, politically very able, but that is going to be something they're going to have to deal with. So what's the hope? Because I don't want to sort of end on a negative. The hope is that actually insurance companies are incredibly good and very clever at thinking of financing mechanisms. And there's so many examples of this. And I would even say Flood Re was a clever example that people are looking around the world at that sort of system. But they've got to sort of avoid being the political scapegoats.
Thank you. We are finishing 45 seconds early. So John, Emma, Jonathan, Alex, and Alex, thank you very much.